Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. This is going to just kind of be, I know we're 2 months past your anniversary, but we're still just going to kind of look back at your first year here, some of your accomplishments, some things that you're hoping to work on in the upcoming year. And so just to begin, what do you feel are your biggest accomplishments of your first year here in Louisville?
Well, I think it's the morale, getting the morale back on an upward trajectory within the department, handling police business. There's a sense of belief, I believe, in where we're going. It's a strong department. It's a strong department, but when I arrived, it was definitely down. And I just needed to get folks in a space where they realize that the community supports them. And I think that the community has done a very favorable job of expressing that, and it makes a huge difference. It just does.
And do you feel that there are areas that you need to improve on in the upcoming year? Anything specific that you think your department may not have handled correctly in this past year?
Well, I think, sure. I mean, I'm always looking to improve. I'll never sit there and say that we're where we need to be, ever. Obviously, the violent crime, and specifically the homicides. Oddly, violent crime year-to-date is down, but when you have the homicides we're having, the math becomes highly secondary. So the violent crime, we really have to do a stronger job of reining in. We have a lot of hiring to do. We obviously have a huge amount of work to do with the community, particularly the Black community. So I mean, we have large obstacles, but none of them are insurmountable, but for sure.
You mentioned violent crime. This past week, there were 2 officer-involved shootings, and then over the weekend, several people died in a very short period of time of gun violence. What are you doing specifically to stop that? What are you telling your officers? Are there memos you're sending out? And this has to also be difficult for your officers to deal with. A lot on their plates, a lot of negativity that they're seeing. Is when you talk about morale, is that something else that you are considering working on?
You cannot, and policing historically has not been good at being aware of the mental state of officers. So officer wellness is finally in our profession becoming spoken about without the stigmas that were historically there. So you are spot on in saying, how are the officers? Are you checking in with them? Are you providing them the necessary support? Because when they are continually responding to acts of violence, it's most certainly traumatic. In terms of the violent crime, this weekend we had 6 homicides in 3 days. It's absolutely deflating. But you can either sit there with your head down, or you can step back, re-engage, and figure out, okay, what can we do differently? Where were the missed opportunities? Of these 6, none of them are random. They all have a personal relationship of some sort, and 3 of them are attributable tied to domestic violence. That is an area that I'm concerned with. I feel as though in 2022 we have seen a hastened pace on domestic violence. And that's a harder one to get your arms around because so often sometimes there's indicators, but sometimes there's not. And so it's going to be critical that we really work with our nonprofits and our partners to ensure that victims of domestic violence know that there's a support system for them.
Why do you think there is that rise in domestic violence? I mean, you see studies nationwide, pandemic, there weren't a lot of people checking in on certain situations. Do you think that had to do with this, or is there something else you're seeing in the community?
Right. So I think that unfortunately we won't really have our arms around to all of the negatives associated with the pandemic till years down the road when the research has been done. I definitely think that the pandemic has played a factor. You know, for so many people, whether it's abused spouses or children, their safety zone has been work and school. And not having that, I think, has really isolated people, some of the folks who are most in need of support. So it's absolutely a contributing factor, but I also think there's just, we don't like to talk about it, but there's absolutely, there's a never-ending supply of guns on the street. The accessibility to weapons in the United States is just, we've just given up on it. And that's a problem, because if people don't have conflict management skills or anger management skills and they have a gun, they shoot people. And we've become conditioned to it, I think, which is a very dangerous space to be in.
Do you think that your officers have the training that they need to handle situations that they may come across in the field?
I think that the department is very well trained, but I also think that for far too long we have put social work on their laps. And it is very hard to pivot from a volatile, truly law enforcement position to a caseworker, social worker position. And I think that with the city rolling out the deflection program, group violence intervention, some of these programs that are geared towards our same audience but provide non-law enforcement solutions, I think down the road we will absolutely glean the benefits of that.
And so you don't think that'll be an immediate benefit? It'll take years to build
Oh,
up?
when you're talking about addressing the social ills of society and the absence of services, you are not going to close a gap that has been there for 25 or 30 years in 6 months. That is simply not realistic, but you have to start. And so I think that there's huge opportunities, but it is not realistic to think that there's going to be data supporting dramatic success in any short order.
And when you got here, is it easier, harder than you expected? Did things come up that you weren't expecting?
COVID made it far more difficult because people weren't out. And Zoom works, but Zoom is just very different than actually being in a room with an individual. It's much harder to learn a community when no one is out, right? Community meetings for me have always been really significant and important, and how you really get a temperature of what the community is feeling. Those weren't occurring. So I would absolutely say that the reopening of society has made things much, much more manageable.
Is that where you plan to work on improving these relations? What are you doing to improve the community relations here in Louisville? And are they similar to what you saw in Atlanta? Are they similar to other places you've been?
I think that your cities all are struggling. There's definitely a sense of have and have nots. I think that's in most cities. The gun violence disproportionately impacts your lower income areas, which in cities is historically the Black communities. So you're dealing with very similar issues across the cities. You cannot do enough in the way of outreach. You cannot do enough in the way of training officers. But the reality of it is, at the end of the day, we will be judged on how we're performing day in and day out.
We hear a lot of times that nationwide crime is rising, but crime is rising here, and according to the Pegasus Institute, we had a higher homicide rate per capita than some of the most dangerous cities historically in the country, Chicago, Philadelphia. Why is that? Are you concerned? Do you think Louisville is a safe place to live?
So first off, year to date, our violent crime, type Part 1 crime, which is what the FBI measures, we're down 14%. Our violent crime going into this weekend was down 19%. But what I will say to folks is, when you are having homicides like we're having at the clip we're having, again, data becomes, it's secondary. It's not what people want to hear. The Pegasus Institute is but one institute. I don't entirely align with how they've collated some of their data. That being said, am I happy with where we're at? Am I satisfied with where we're at? No, that we have too many homicides. But I will submit to you that there is very few cities, a handful, that are not struggling with violent crime. And so, again, it goes back to, what are we doing to combat it? LMPD has exceptionally strong partnerships with our federal agencies, and that is critical. especially when you're dealing with individuals who are repeat violent offenders and they're continually getting out on home incarceration or no bond. I mean, it's just preposterous. And so we've had to really lean into our federal partners to help shore up some of the judiciary softness that we're seeing at the state level. That's huge. I just think the bigger obstacle is we are dealing with, again, this proliferation of illegal weapons, many of which are in the hands of juveniles. So this past week, we get a car full of 4 juveniles with assault rifles, every one of them loaded, has a loaded assault rifle. Well, what are they doing? Where are they going? This is not good. But what is going to be the solution other than here, go back home, don't do that, go back to school? I mean, that's not realistic to think that this is going to end well. It may not be tomorrow, but 6 months, a year, the juvenile is either going to end up killing someone or they're going to get killed. So the roadmap is not difficult, but there has to be the energy behind dealing with these issues.
Overall, do you feel like crime is trending younger? And here in Kentucky, the juvenile justice system was reformed in 2014. Of course, they are continually going back to look at that reform that they did and making changes at the state level. But do you feel how it stands now that your department has the tools it needs and the deterrence factor to keep kids from preventing crimes, keep the city safe, and also, in theory, keep these kids from being punished for life for making these mistakes?
That's a rather convoluted question. So let me say this. I do not advocate for young people being incarcerated. That is not a solution. That being said, when kids have guns and are shooting one another, putting them back in the neighborhoods is also not a solution. So the question is, what options are out there? And this is where I will say all day long that the state comes up short. And there just has to be an investment in some form or fashion of rehabilitating young people who do not have the necessary support system. And there has to be a middle ground. And what happens is people tend to become entrenched in their positions. They're either, well, lock them up, throw away the key, or give them a hug. Okay, well, you know what? We've been doing that. And neither solution is favorable to any of us. So I think that there has to be, again, and when I say the energy, there has to be the willingness to come to the table and identify truly purposeful solutions. There has to be the funding dedicated to it. It's not impossible, but it has to be prioritized.
What would you like to see? Are there models out there in other states or other communities that you've seen that you think could be successful here?
I'm sure there are. I mean, I think that I think that states are struggling. I think states are struggling to find what's appropriate, but there certainly are models that have effectiveness. There are things that can be done. Whereas I just feel we're in a space that we're really right now, we're just managing a crisis and we're not identifying and instituting solutions.
And now in 2021, our clearance rate was about 35%, which is much lower than the national average. Why is that? And also, there are debates also on if clearance rates are even a good tool to use to measure the effectiveness of a police department. Do you feel like clearance rate is a good tool?
Clearance rates are essential. They're essential if you're going to get a handle on violent crime. It's essential that your clearance rates on homicides and robberies are at the national level or above. And the reason I say that is these are your most violent individuals. And if you are not putting them in jail, then rest assured they're going to keep committing violence. When I came here, 2 things jumped out at me. Because yes, the clearance rate for homicide is not where it needs to be. But the unit understood that. They didn't like it. They weren't proud of it. So it wasn't a lack of effort or work or apathy. They were very frustrated. Okay, so let's look at the unit. 2 things jumped out. 1, they were understaffed. the homicide detectives were managing a far greater caseload than they should be doing. And the problem with that is, what that means is I'm going to start working a case, and then before I can make the necessary inroads, I'm going to get assigned another case. And the other thing was that DNA testing is imperative to making arrests in homicides. And the backlog of DNA testing for the department was approximately 2 years. So what that means is the individual who's killed someone is going to be on the street, at least probably for another 2 years, if you don't have other non-forensic evidence to make a conviction. So we have resolved that issue as well. So I think that we should now be in a space where I would expect the clearance rate to go up. That certainly is my ideal, but yes, clearance rates are very relevant.
Okay, I'm gonna go to this one about Tyree. That was a very tough day when Tyree got killed. But you said that you want JCPS to have its own police force. Why is that? And then also, do you feel that the SRO program that they have announced is going to help? Will it reduce the burden on LMPD? Will it reduce crime in the city? Do you think SROs are beneficial at all?
So Tyree's death was just sickening. And that kid was doing everything we want of a child. Everything we want of a child. And he's just gone down. And so what do? We go to a podium, we say it's unacceptable. I think at the time he was the 20th kid killed in the city, and then everyone goes their respective ways. That's the reality of it. And what I would say is, having sat that day or the day before in his mom's living room and just seen his sibling, whose life is now, gone upside down, the mom's world's gone upside down. No, I'm not going to just stand at a podium and say this is unacceptable. What are we going to do differently? And this goes back to my space of, what are we doing differently? And you cannot, as a community, just look at government and think, fix this. It's just not that simple. And there's that tendency to say, well, that's that school, that's that part of the world, that's not my problem. And it's like, no, we all have to take ownership of this. I think that here is my heartburn around the schools. And again, this is where folks go into the space of, well, you just want to lock kids up. No, I don't want to lock children up at all. I'll be the first person to say we're in this space because for far too many years, we locked up young black men and threw away the key for behaviors we were not locking up white people for. We demonize crack cocaine, but pure cocaine and other illegal substances were not stigmatized like that. That's a fact. That being said, guns are going to school, gangs are in the school. Why then are we not saying, okay, we need to be proactive in this space if we're going to change the trajectory? Is it realistic to think that teachers, in addition to teaching, being counselors, being therapists, now have to break up fights? Now they have to disarm children? Now they have to learn about gangs? That's my frustration. And again, it's not about pointing a finger, about finding fault, but it's saying, if we don't go to the table and demand solutions from one another, then it's not realistic to think that in 10 years anything will be different.
And so do you think that a full police force would be helpful? And also, would it be helpful just for your officers? Do you get called to JCPS often?
I think that the key is, I think the upside, so let me say this. I had the fortune of working with a school superintendent in Atlanta, who essentially said, Atlanta Police Department, not using you. I'm going to have my own police department. And that superintendent had their own police department, and what it allowed them to do was they were able to provide specific instruction to law enforcement on what they could not do. And so it really became a mentorship role. It wasn't one of arresting people. But these folks were also trained. They knew how to get guns off of children. They knew how to recognize gangs. They were constantly in communication with us in the street about, hey, this fight occurred at school today. It's going to spill over the neighborhood. So I think what I would say is, I think the key is you have to have people who are trained and capable of inserting themselves into this violence that is occurring and understanding how to de-escalate it. And I don't know how you can, I just don't see how we can just keep expecting teachers to manage this.
And so the debate that a lot of people had after Tyree's death is, what is a police force in the school going to do outside the school? What are they going to do on the bus stop? What are they going to do on the school bus? You feel that, and you saw, it sounds like firsthand, it working in Atlanta, of you had a communication, you knew, and I don't want to say problem children, but you knew about problems as they were happening, so you might be able to prevent something that may happen in the community.
It's not to be arrest-driven. Arrest-driven serves no purpose. So here's the thing. Why is a child taking a gun to school? Typically, if you talk to young people, they'll tell you they don't feel safe. Okay, so let's identify why you don't feel safe. That's going to come back to probably outside the school. So we have to have that communication to understand, why is this child not feeling safe? What can we, LMPD, do in that child's neighborhood so that they don't feel they have to take a gun to school? Are they being bullied? And then, how are they getting the gun? Somebody's arming them. So I think it's not as simple as saying, oh, we're going to arrest a kid, or no. It's getting to the root cause of the problem. I don't think most children want to go to school with a gun. I don't think most kids want to fight. I think they want to be kids. I think they make these decisions based on a need to just protect themselves.
And do you feel that Louisville has a gang problem?
I think Louisville has gangs like every city has gangs, right? And if you have gangs, you got a problem. There's no two ways about that. So the question then is, okay, what's the purpose of the gangs? What are they doing? What are they attempting to do? Are they attempting to create a very strong drug trade? Are they attempting to create a hierarchy in the violence? So I mean, we have a very strong understanding of those gangs in the city. We've made some incredibly solid arrests, and our federal partners have been wonderful in helping us get indictments. But anytime you have gangs, you have a problem.
Do you feel LMPD's traffic stop policy is sufficient to keep our streets safe? And do you think that routine traffic stops provide good opportunities for police to reduce crime by finding potentially illegal substances or items in a person's car? Because there was a policy change, I believe it was in 2019, surrounding traffic stops.
So it was really interesting when I came here, because you could see from the data that in 2019, when I was looking at to try to understand the violent crime, in 2019 there was this immediate spike in violent crime. And I was, what's this spate of violence? And it was very interesting, and it went on for a while, and then the violent crime, it decreased, and then right around the time of the protest starting, the violent crime soared back up. And so it took me a while to figure out that the time it spiked was when there'd been all this discussion around traffic stops. What I will say to you is, as a law enforcement agency, you have to do traffic enforcement. Anybody that has driven in this city can see that we need to do more traffic enforcement. The speeds on the interstate, the running of the red lights, the traffic fatalities, it's far greater than it should be. And this is one of the key reasons I want to get our staffing up, because I think that that's something that impacts the community as a whole. And it's very concerning when people just think that 100 miles an hour on an interstate is just normal. That being said, where this agency, like many others, got itself in trouble was clearly there was some targeted enforcement The data shows that all day long. And so if you are profiling and making traffic stops based on an individual's race, the neighborhood they're in, or you're even profiling the car, that's unlawful. So the key is, from where I'm sitting, is it's getting as much information as we can out of each traffic stop that the officers conducted on the officer's stop, so that we can identify if there's behaviors by the officer that are discriminatory. Give you an example. If you have an officer and they do 20 stops and 18 of them or 15 of them are females between the ages of 20 and 25, there's something going on here. That's called a clue. And so it's incumbent upon us as supervisors to immediately address that and to start looking at the body-worn camera footage and understanding what's going on here.
So is that something that you are now doing?
Yes, that is one of the many things that we're pushing forward on. So first off is the collection of traffic stop data is not where it needs to be, but we have to coordinate to be allowed to do it with the state. So I have to get permission from the state to modify the actual system because we share a reporting platform. And then the second thing is we're working to hire civilians who can audit the body-worn cameras so we can get more information real time. So the capacity to do it is right there on the horizon, and it's really important to do. It's really important to do. So I think when you say do traffic, yes, but you have to do it right, and you have to do it lawful. And I think the Hilliard-Heinz report pointed out that that was not the case at all. And so I understand why it was suspended. But it's not coincidental that violent crime soared when officers stopped doing any traffic.
Nonviolent crime.
Right.
That is still happening. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this is not getting solved because, rightfully so, you're busy. You have a lot of officers that are dealing with violent crime that obviously does take precedent. What is being done to address nonviolent crime in the city?
Right.
And is that something that is a struggle for LMPD because of staffing?
I think that, so nonviolent crime, no, it doesn't get the attention in most cities that it should. But what I'll say to you is it goes well beyond a staffing issue. So if your courts are not prosecuting people that shoot people, do you think that they're going to prosecute someone who breaks into a car? It's not going to happen. Now, the flip side is what many folks will say in the judicial system, and they're correct, is the individuals breaking into cars, breaking into homes, often have underlying mental health, substance abuse conditions that need addressing. Agree all day long. So the key, this goes back to, are we just making an arrest and having the person walk out the door, or are we giving them some assistance? So I think there's a bigger issue that you'll find is that, again, it's the community getting its arms around the problem. I think a lot of funding in this last budget was appropriated by the mayor and council to really address some of these underlying issues. But again, it's going to take a minute to get upright. In the meantime, it's very frustrating. It's discouraging for someone. No one wants to be a victim of crime. So would I like to have more people that can be looking at these crimes and solving them? Absolutely. But that being said, I can still tell you that alone is not going to solve the frustration that a community member may have.
Okay. I have plenty more questions, but I'll cut it there because I appreciate the time that you gave me.
Thank you.